Okay. Theoretically, that's done. I don't know if it's going to work, but anyway, see if anybody comes up from MKP. So I don't know what's happening now. Okay. There we are. Okay, so we're back. So either this is working or it's not. Okay, so as I promised last week, I wanted to go. We went, Dale. We went through the whole of the Iron John story. So the audio file is on the website if you want to listen to it. So there's an audio file and there's a video file, but I'd recommend the audio file. There's a lot of waffle in the video file, which is not necessary. So I wanted to go.
What website is that? What website is that?
samsleeman.com. Yeah.
Okay.
And so it's there as an audio file. The video file is there, but I think the audio file's shorter and it's more succinct. So I wanted to go to the, in a way, every journey begins because you have a destination in mind, right? Yes, agreed.
Yeah.
Right. So in the Iron John story, it would be good then to have an understanding of the destination in order to unpack a lot of the merits of the story and what it's implying and what it's trying to communicate. So that's where I wanted to go this evening. And I wanted to read, I've got a couple of verses here which sort of traverse that territory. So I assume Francois will come up in his usual style at about 20 past. So I don't know who else is coming, but anyway, let's go with what we've got. So this is a poem by D.H. Lawrence, and it's quite impactful. It says, it begins, I am not a mechanism. I am not a mechanism, an assembly of various sections. And it is not because the mechanism is working wrongly that I am ill. I am ill because of wounds to the soul. I am ill because of wounds to the soul, to the deep emotional self. And the wounds to the soul take a long, long time, and only time can help, and patience, and a certain difficult repentance. A long and difficult repentance. The realization of life's mistake and the freeing of oneself from the endless repetition of the mistake which mankind has at large has chosen to sanctify. The long and difficult repentance, the realization of life's mistake and the freeing of oneself from the endless repetition of the mistake which mankind at large has chosen to sanctify. So I'm reading that because it ties in with the mystical marriage that happens at the end of the story, which is the culmination of the story, which was actually the finale of the whole journey. Anyway, here's another little one that traverses maybe similar territory. The wind one brilliant day called to my soul with the odor of jasmine. The wind one brilliant day called to my soul with the odor of jasmine. And the north wind said, in return for the odor of my jasmine, give me the odor of all your roses. And I replied, I have no roses. All the flowers in my garden are dead. No matter, said the north wind, I'll take the dried up petals and leaves. And the north wind left. And I cried as I thought, what have you done with the garden that was entrusted to you so long ago? So there's something in this thing, because we started off with so much, and we end up with something else, and it's a difficult journey. So yeah, I think we're going to leave that there for now. And I'll save one poem for the end for tonight. So Frank, you were here last week. Did you have any questions, any aha moments, or would you like to say anything about what we went through last week?
Not really. I do appreciate the way you bring in other fairy tales into the story to show how they all point to the same thing sometimes. And I love the Iron John story. And, you know, when I first did my MKP weekend, it was only the first half. I never heard about him getting married. And so when I read the book and heard of the marriage, it was like, yeah, finally, a completion to the story. It didn't leave me hanging like it did when I only heard the first half.
Yeah. So the mystical marriage, the marriage that happens at the end. So Dale, just to recap, have you heard the story right through, Dale?
Yeah, I mean, I've it's interesting. I mean, I know it's actually, yeah. I mean, the first part of the story I know quite well. It's interesting. The ending is blurry for me. So, I mean, kind of up to the part of the boy, you know, using the key and unlocking the cage, and the boy disappearing into the forest with the wild man. You know, the boy on the old man, the wild man's shoulders. That's what as far as I got. Was anything further than that?
Okay. So just to recap about the royal wedding. So at the end of the story, there's a wedding where the young man has formed a love relationship with the girl who loves gold. And so there's certain trials and tribulations in order to get there, but ultimately he comes into the king's chamber and he says to the father of the girl that he's the son of a king and he comes from another kingdom and he's got gold and silver in plenty. He doesn't need any gold or silver. And so because he had saved the castle from being overrun by hostile forces, the king felt he was in his debt and asked what he could give him, if he could do anything for him. So he said, yeah, I'd like to marry your daughter. And the daughter was obviously keen on this as well. And the narrative said that she went over and kissed him. And so the wedding was organized. And the narrative said that as the wedding was taking place, just before the vows were said, the doors opened and in walked a king and a queen, and they were the parents of the young man, who is us, by the way. And so there was a lot of rejoicing and hugging and all of that sort of stuff, I'm sure. And then just as everybody settled down and they were going to carry on with the ceremony, the doors opened again and in walked a king with a large retinue of people following along with gifts and boxes and fruit and honey and everything from the forest. And this king walked up to us and said, I am Iron John, and you have freed me from the curse that was put onto me by the dark magician. And so now I am free, thanks to you. So the wedding took place with much ceremony. And the king of that particular kingdom asked the young man what would he like for a wedding present. And he said, his answer was, I want dominion over all of the wild places. I want dominion over all of the wild places. And that's all he asked for. And he said he would go and live and rule over the wild places with his queen. And that was the end of the story, or the beginning, depending on how you like to look at it. And you know those most annoying lines in all of fairy stories, and they were married and they lived happily ever after. So, yeah. So I'm just wondering, how that lands with you, and what do you think that might mean before I tell you what I think it means, can mean. This is John Foster. Pedley says he doesn't think he can make it tonight. So this is not a rhetorical question, guys. Any thoughts, ideas, feelings?
I've just got a question, Sam. The young man who went to the lake to actually capture the wild man is the one who is rewarded with the marriage of the king's daughter.
No, that's the adventurer.
Okay.
The one whose journey this story describes is us. We start off as the small boy whose golden ball rolled into the cage. So that is the person that it refers to. And then in the second half of the story, there's a time for the person to grow into a young man. And through different trials and tribulations, he ends up at the castle, and interacts with the king's daughter.
So for me, it sounds like you mentioned the thing about he's not attached to the gold and the silver, so he's let go of the density of often the actual trappings of royalty, and he wants to go and rule over the wild areas. So he doesn't want to lose his wildness and his, I don't know, that part of him that so often gets squashed in many modern men.
Yeah, definitely he wants to retain his connection with wildness.
I was on a Boys to Men. We go into the schools and do a virtual training or group session where we enlighten the boys about responsibility, accountability, integrity. And anyway, I had to tell a story about my grandfather, and I was bouncing a ball. And so because of hearing the story last week, I changed it to my golden ball. And it just it showed me how the influence of the stories can travel into what I do in my life. And So it was really sweet just for me to even think of that, of changing it to my golden ball.
Right.
I was throwing it up in the air and catching it. And it took me right back into the process on the weekend where they have all the men throwing the balls up in the air, you know. It was pretty sweet, sweet memories.
So, yeah, great. Thank you, Frank. Thanks. So the wedding. What so I've called it the mystical marriage. In other traditions, that's what it's called. This is the union between the ego and the soul. So that's a tricky one straight away, I suppose.
Was there a thing where he was trying to marry without his? Was he worried that his parents wouldn't support the marriage? I understood, and maybe I misunderstood, but he said that his parents suddenly arrived in unannounced in the banquet hall and were very supportive of the marriage.
Well, that's the other tricky part. You see, in the narrative of the story, when the young boy leaves the castle with Iron John says to him, "You'll never see your parents again." So the parents never reappear in the story until the wedding at the end. So there's something to do there with the redemption that this is the other tricky thing. You know, in the storytelling tradition, or in most of the initiation traditions, it is the child that has to redeem the parents. So that's a tricky one, because we spend a lot of years as children and teenagers and young adults waiting for the good parent to come along and make it all right, and put their hand on our heads and say, there, you know, you were treated really badly, and yeah, you know, it's all going to be all right now, which obviously it isn't. So, I mean, even right back down into the Christian tradition, we have the image of the son redeeming the father. So this is an old idea. And so when this wedding took place, when this young man was now ready to make that commitment, then the parents can reappear.
I didn't get that the parents, his original parents, appeared. There was the entrance of the king, who was the father of the daughter, and then there was the entrance of the king, who was Wild John. Where is the parents?
No, the entrance of the king and the queen who entered the chapel at the time of that they were preparing to make the vows was the young man's, who I call Ivan, so we know who we're talking about, Ivan's parents. Because if there was a wedding, then the bride and the groom and the bride's family would already be in the ceremony, not so?
Yeah, it makes sense now that I look at it. Yeah, I just never realized that before. Huh.
So some things have to take place before the parents can reappear. The child, who is us, we have to be strong enough to have left all of the little Velcros, you know, those little barbs that the parents send out. We have to be our own person. We have to have come to understand who we are and what we stand for. honor our parents, but not be swayed by whatever their politics are. And that's a really difficult one. So, and it's the same about understanding what this wedding is about. Who's getting married here? So the young man, who's I called Ivan, represents our ego. And he has gone on a long journey in order to make himself ready to marry, I would say, let's call him the divine king's daughter, which would be our soul. Because we know this story doesn't happen in our world, right? So this wedding is really a rare occasion, and it's really special when it happens. Which is the whole purpose in a way of stories, the hero's journey type stories, because the hero's journey type stories has the ability to take the ego on a journey into other spaces and times, so that the ego can experience something else from what it usually experiences, and may introduce it to something which is transpersonal. So that's the point of the wedding. So that the ego and the soul have to be now equal partners. So I don't know if you've ever heard me talking about squaring the circle.
No, I haven't heard that.
Okay, so just to sort of digress a little bit, if we consider what we understand in MKP by the axis mundi, we have the feminine, nature, the great mother, chaos, and sort of a label for that would be undifferentiated unity. And then in the above direction, we have logos and ritual and law. And the sort of key word for that would be differentiated unity. So there's a lovely piece here by James Hillman, if I can find it quickly. So I wasn't actually intending to use it tonight. Yeah, there it is. So I'm going to read this part, and that this will hopefully will make it more clear. The missing father is not your or my personal father. He is the absent father of our culture. The viable senex, senex is just Latin for old man. The viable senex who provides not only daily bread, but spirit through meaning and order. The missing father is the dead God who offered a focus for spiritual things. The missing father is the dead God who offered us focus for spiritual things. Without this focus, which is where our culture is right now, most of it, without this focus, we turn to dreams and oracles rather than to prayer, code, and tradition and ritual. When mother replaces father, magic substitutes for logos, and the sun priests contaminate the pure spirit. So now, unable to go backwards to retrieve the dead father of tradition, we go downwards into the mother of the collective unconscious and seek an all-embracing comprehension. We ask for help in getting through the narrow straits without harm. The sun, that's all of us, wants invulnerability. Grant us protection, foreknowledge, cherish us. Our prayer is to the night for a dream, to a love for understanding, to a little rite or an exercise for a moment of wisdom. Above all, we want reassurance that everything will come out all right at the end. Without the Father, we lose the capacity which Church recognizes as the discrimination of spirits, the ability to know a call when we hear one and to discriminate between the voices. The mother encourages her son, go ahead and embrace it all. For her, all equals everything. The father's instruction, on the contrary, is all equals nothing unless be precisely discriminated. So, see, we have the two poles of the axis mundi. We have the above pole of code and tradition. We have the below code of mother, undifferentiated unity below, differentiated unity above. So when we combine those two things in the middle, we square, I call it anyway, squaring the circle. So the idea is from Leonardo da Vinci's Perfect Man, the Vitruvian Man, where he stands in the middle of the circle and the area of the square, which is differentiated unity of above, and the area of the circle, undifferentiated unity of below, occupy the same space. And that is the mystical marriage. And so that was the whole point of the Iron John story, was to get us from the point where we lost our golden ball and let it roll into the cage to get to the mystical marriage at the end. And I think our mother plotted seriously to make this happen. So Nietzsche said a similar thing. God is dead, and we have killed him, you and I. But I have come too soon. This prodigious event is still on its way, still wandering and has not yet reached the ears of men. Lightning and thunder require time. The light of the stars require time. Deeds, though done, still require time to be seen and to be heard. This deed is even more distant from them than those most distant stars, and yet they have done it to themselves. God is dead, remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murder of all murderers? What was the holiest and mighty of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe the blood off us? What water is there to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement and what sacred games shall we have to invent? Is it not the greatest of this deed is too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it? So Nietzsche also understood the trickiness of this thing. Maybe that's a bridge too far. I don't know. So that's the essence of the mystical marriage. And that's the essence of squaring the circle. And at the same time, it's the essence of the axis mundi, because we as mankind, we stand between those two poles like a transformer. And the energies of the divine from above and the energies of the divine from below flow through us and out into the manifest universe. This was the image in the Grail story, the Parsifal story, where the king was wounded and the ceremony couldn't take place because the masculine had absconded or was missing. And so the feminine went through their half of the ritual, but it could never be successful because the true masculine was not present. And so the land had fallen into a wasteland. So there's a lot of stuff encoded in this story for those who are prepared to peel back the layers and unhinge our minds and be open to possibilities. So in order to understand some of this, we really need to understand how ego is formed. And we need to have a little bit of an understanding of what soul is. So we know that soul gets lost because is represented by the golden ball that rolled into the wild man's cage. Because that's where it has to go. If it leaves us, it has to go back into wildness. You can't destroy that. It just goes back. It lives either in the wild man's cage because he happened to be there, or it goes back into the enormous forest and waits impatiently for us and regresses, unfortunately, it seems. That the things which get split off in order to save the ego from being overwhelmed regress over time. And so those things that really belong to us can become hostile to us when we go back there 30 or 40 years later to retrieve them. So we need to approach it in the right way. So the story describes the process by which that can happen. So that's a pretty big chunk. Anybody want to say anything?
Yeah, I like the explanation of the golden ball, and I want to ask how the 3 times when he's sitting by the pond and when a hair falls in there, his finger dips in there, his whole head of hair turns gold. How do those relate to this mystical marriage? What are those symbols of the 3 times that things turn to gold?
Well, that's a whole chapter in itself. But anyway, let's go there. That's not a problem. We can go there. We can go there again because it's worth unpacking more than once. So the 3 days at the Golden Pond also represent the 3 aspects of the Axis Mundi and other stuff. So because we've spoken about the Axis Mundi, it's easier maybe to hang those 3 days at the pond on that. So obviously the first day at the pond, his finger is hurting him. Robert Bly, because I know you've got the book because I've seen you show it to us. Robert Bly talks about the elevation of our wound. That holding our finger up so it doesn't throb, so the blood doesn't get up there, is a metaphor for elevating our wound so that we can see it, so that we can deal with it, so we can retrieve some of that shadow material. But there's also deeper implications of the first day at the pond. I mean, And in some of the narratives, it's a well. It isn't a pond. And that's another interesting little twist, because the idea of a well is that you have a bucket on a rope and that you pull up a bucket full of water at a time. And the image of that is that you only pull up as much stuff from the underworld, from the unconscious, from the Great Mother, as you can deal with at any one time. And the stonework around the well, it's like an electrician or an atomic physicist. We're all interested in insulation. An electrician needs to understand, must make sure that everything is insulated, and so that the current only goes in safe passages along the wires and to the switches. There mustn't be bare wires touching anywhere which can short out. So the well is a metaphor for ego, because that is the job of the ego. Our ego's job is to make sure we don't get overwhelmed by content from the unconscious. Otherwise, we become psychotic. So the ego is like the warrior and patrols the boundaries and makes sure that nothing enters our kingdom, our personal kingdom, which is going to damage us. That's what it's supposed to do. That's one of its true jobs. And it is supposed to work under the auspices of the king, which would be the ruling masculine principle in this case. So we digressed a little bit from the 3 days at the pond. So that image of the well fits really well here. And I didn't know when I wrote the chapters whether to use the well or the pond. So I chose the pond because it was a little bit more natural. And if you've ever, as a child, been tadpoling down at the river where the frogs spawn and that white gooey stuff is all stuck to the grass along the edges, and there's little tadpoles swimming there. And the image of the tadpole is that amphibian that starts off as a fish, starts off as a water creature, and then becomes an air-breathing creature. Not that dissimilar to a human beings. We start off in a bath of amniotic fluid, and we wriggle around in there, and then all of a sudden we have to become an air-breathing creature. So there's a transformation and an initiation at that point. So there's a book by a guy called Otto Rank. I think if you look him up, he's on the internet. He writes about that initiation process. And Stan Grof also talks about it in terms of the different birth matrices, which he discovered through holotropic breathwork. After LSD was banned, he was looking for a way to have that transpersonal experience, and so hit upon holotropic breathwork, and has recorded lots of details of people's journeys through the gestation and through the birth canal and what they experienced. So getting back to the pond, the first day at the pond, in a way, encompasses all of that nature, all of that tadpoles and birds and little animals that come down to drink. It's just, that pond is just alive with life itself. And why wouldn't we put our finger in it to heal it? So the instruction was, don't let anything defile the pond. It didn't say don't let anything fall in it, because obviously there's going to be birds come down there to drink, and deer and little animals. So obviously things are going in and out of the pond all the time. The instruction was, don't let anything defile the pond, which is an instruction to say, learn how to patrol the boundaries of your own self, and make sure nothing comes into your pond to defile it. So that's another tricky one. Somewhere here, I've got a poem about that. Where is it? Yeah, The Bread and the Wine by Frederick Holder. Oh, friends, we arrived too late. Oh, friends, we arrived too late. The divine energies are still alive, but isolated above us in the archetypal world. They keep on going there and apparently don't bother whether humans live or not. And that is a heavenly mercy. Sometimes a human's clay is not strong enough to take the divine water. Sometimes a human's clay is not strong enough to take the divine water. Humans can carry the divine only sometimes. What is living now, night dreams of them, but craziness helps, and so does sleep. Grief and the night toughen us. Until people capable of sacrifice once more rock in the iron cradle, desire people like the ancients, strong enough for that water. In thunderstorms it will arrive. In thunderstorms it will arrive. I have the feeling often, meanwhile, it is better to sleep, since the guest comes so seldom. We waste our lives waiting, and I haven't the faintest idea how to act or talk. In the lean years, who needs poets? But poets, as you say, are like the holy disciple of the wild one, the one who used to stroll over the fields and through the enormous forests and through the whole divine night. So we understand from that poem that we need to prepare ourselves in order to carry this water, this divine energy. And that's the teaching of the first day of the pond. Don't let anything defile the pond. Prepare yourself. So Iron John comes in after the end of the first day, and he said, I felt something fall into the pond about 2 o'clock. And then he said a wonderful thing. These are all mentoring moments, the way that we should mentor people. He said, it's not too serious, but it mustn't happen again. So he knows that something's fallen into the pond. So he knows that we've had our first lesson. And he knows that that lesson is now complete. So now he must give us a second lesson. So on the second day, he comes back to us. We're lying there in the bed of moss that he's made for us next to the pond. And he says, okay, same rules apply. Don't let anything defile the pond. And so now we're very careful to keep our golden finger out of the pond. And we're guarding and watching and making sure nothing defiles the pond, learning what that might be. We have to understand also that a day in the life of a story like this could be 15 or 20 years, could be a whole lifetime, could be a whole lifetime. So time is different in stories. That's why we say at the beginning of the story, we're leaving our time now. We are leaving our time now. There are places where time moves faster than here, and a place where time moves more slowly than here. So we're spending a period of time at the pond. And as we know what the narrative said, of ultimately a single hair falls into the water and turns to gold. Zing! Shit. So what do? Like good humans, we put it in our pocket and pretend it didn't happen. So Iron John comes in about 4 o'clock. He says, I felt something fall into the pond at 2 o'clock. It's not that serious, but it mustn't happen again. Okay. So we can imagine there was other conversations went on, but that's what the narrative says to us. So why is a single hair important, and what does it symbolize? It symbolizes the importance of you and I as individuals, that our life, your life, my life is important. So we understand in the storytelling tradition and in other traditions that it's understood that the children bring gifts into the world to solve the problems of the world when they're born, which is why we celebrate birth as such a wonderful event. Because in the old way, in the old tradition, we understood that this child was bringing healing to the community that it was incarnated into. So on the weekend, when men come off the carpet, when I'm blessing them anyway, that's what I'm telling them. Because when they say what qualities that they brought with them, what qualities that they've discovered through their carpet process, then I grab them and I show them all around the group of men who were standing. I said, now here is a man who's brought compassion. Here is a man who's brought love. Here is a man who's brought courage and understanding into the world. We need that. We welcome that. And that's why the symbol of a single hair, one individual, is so important. And that's the middle ground of the axis mundi, because we stand as human mankind, which of course includes women, between those two poles as a single strand. So while we do belong to collectives, we also do it individually, because each of us brought particular gifts that only we can express. Viktor Frankl had something to say about that. This is Viktor Frankl. You know who Viktor Frankl is, Dale? No, not really.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Didn't he survived the Holocaust, didn't he?
Yeah. So he developed a sort of a psychotherapy called logos therapy. Okay. So what he discovered during the Holocaust was the people who survived are those who had some meaning in their life and some purpose in order to carry on. And those who didn't have that succumbed really quickly. So this is what he said anyway. As each situation in life represents a challenge to man and presents a problem for him to solve, the question of meaning in life may actually be reversed. Ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but recognize that it is he who is asked by life. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and to life he can only respond by being responsible. Responsibleness is the very essence of human existence. So one should not search for an abstract meaning of life. Everyone has his own specific vocation or mission in life, Everyone has his own specific vocation or mission in life. Everyone must carry out a concrete assignment that demands fulfillment. Therein he cannot be replaced, nor can his life be repleted. Thus, everybody's task is as unique as the specific opportunity to implement it. So that's the meaning of the single hair, I feel. Some of the meaning. I mean, I'm not saying that that's the whole thing. That's as much as I've understood, been able to understand. I'm sure there's more. I'm sure there's layers and layers which I haven't got to yet, which I'm looking forward to understanding in the future. So that's the second day at the pond. So the third day, the third day was tricky. So we were looking. So Iron John came in and said the same thing, don't let anything defile the pond. Because if something happens again, you'll have to leave me. So, okay. So we're on our big guard and we're looking into the pond, and a little bit like Narcissus, we see our reflection in the water underneath. There's golden fish and golden eels and everything is golden in the pond. And we look into the pond, and then there's a shift in the reflection, because then we begin to see not ourselves as a reflection. And that's a really tricky thing, you see, because when we look in the mirror in the bathroom, we see ourselves through the eyes and the expectations of other people. We don't see ourselves as we truly are. That's why we have a door on the bathroom, so that we can put our mask on before we go out in public. But in this mirror, we didn't see that reflection. We saw ourselves as we truly were and what we were capable of. We saw ourselves as, like if you go to the hardware store and you buy a packet of seeds, and there's a beautiful picture on the front of the seed packets of flowers, that's what it could become if everything is right. The soil that you put it into, and the water and the sunshine and the heat and the cold, that's the possibility that it could become. That doesn't mean to say if you just throw the seeds on the concrete path, that's going to happen. And so we see ourselves in the pond as we truly are and in potential. And we're so fascinated by this, and we're so enamored with this process that our head gets closer and closer to the water, and the narrative says our long hair falls off our shoulders and falls into the water, and our whole head of hair turns to gold. Because now we have understood the potential of our kingship. And if I have ever had that opportunity to have a glimpse into that, it's an amazing thing. I do believe that it happens to everybody at about 12 or 13 or 14. that somehow, somewhere, we kick a door open into the rest of our lives and we get a glimpse, just a glimpse of what we're going to be. In the Parsifal story, when Parsifal ends up at the stream where the Fisher King is in the boat, and the Fisher King and he have a conversation, and the Fisher King takes him back to the castle, and he watches the procession. But when he's 14 or 15, he doesn't understand. He has no context to understand what is going on. And so he doesn't ask the question, which would have healed the land, who does the Grail serve? He doesn't ask the king, what ails thee? Because his mother told him to be polite, which is exactly what Freud said would happen. He doesn't ask the question, and then the next morning, the castle is empty. And his horse is saddled and his clothes are washed and pressed. And as he gets onto his horse and he rides out of the empty courtyard, the drawbridge snaps up and clips the horse's hoof. And so we have that wonderful image, the same as in the Iron John story. When you have a wound to an extremity, the initiation is coming. And when I first came across this little piece of information, I watched it in my life, and it happened over and over and over again. If I stubbed my toe or dropped something on my toe or cut my finger or something, I said, the initiation is coming. So when we tried to open the door of the cage, and our blood ran down the key and lubricated the lock, there was a wound to an extremity, which is the finger we held up on the first day at the pond. So I believe as youngsters, we do have this opportunity, and if the elders and the old male initiators are there around and they can catch that, we can share that with the youngsters. But we have to be open and we have to understand the process for that to happen. And there has to be space, because usually we fill our time up with the youngsters with so much stuff that there isn't really a lot of space to be quiet and silent, and just to listen to them, and to listen not to the words they're saying, but between the words. I remember working with the young guys when they were doing their staff making. We would get, those sticks that the civil engineers drive in the side of the road, so the graders know what the levels are. Those sticks, and we would have paint and hacksaws and drills and beads and stuff, and the guys would make their staff. And then as they were distracted by the making of the staffs, they would talk. And if you just sat there and you listened, you would hear a lot of stuff while that was going on. It was the most beautiful process. So back to the third day at the pond. So our whole head of hair has fallen in the pond now. We know who we are, and we know what in potential we're capable of. So that is our crown. And so we immediately cover our head with, the narrative says, with a bandana or a handkerchief or something, in an attempt to hide our golden hair. And soup has arrived. Thank you, love. Thanks, babes. You see, I get spoiled here, huh? My wife brings me goodies in cups. So there is a story called The Devil's Sooty Brother. You know that story, Frank? No? It's on the website. Everything is on the website. So the reason I want to bring that in right now is that it tells us why we have to hide our gold until the time is right. So in The Devil's Sooty Brother, the young man of the story, who was us, of course, the young ego, he'd just come back from a war situation, and war situations can be quite terrible. And he didn't know what to do, and he was finding it difficult to reconcile himself with what he'd just experienced. And he met this funny little guy in the forest because he'd gone into the forest to see if he could find some peace or solace there. And the little guy offered him a job. He said, "Would you like a job? I've got 3 cooking pots, and I need somebody to just chop some wood and keep the fires going in the cooking pots. Board and lodging is provided, and sort of minimal salary. You think you can do that?" Yeah, I can do that. Anyway, so he follows the little guy, and he goes into the forest, and then he sort of goes down a tunnel which goes under the trees, and when he looks up, he can see the roots of the trees and the water dripping through, and eventually they go quite far down, and eventually they come to a chamber, and inside the chamber there's 3 cooking pots. You know, those African cooking pots where they cook up the people. There's a fire going underneath, and so the guy says, "Look, that's all you have to do. Just keep the fires going and don't look into the pots. And when you're finished, all of the wood chips, just sweep them up and leave them behind the door there." So that's what happened. That went on for a while, a short time or a long time, or however long time that takes, the story says. So, don't look in the pots. That's more or less a statement. You better look in the pots. So we lifted the lid off the pot, and then we saw the corporal from our army days. And we thought, aha, you bloody whatever adjective suits you. You had me in your power once. Now I've got you in mine. So we cut the wood and we made the fire extra strong. So what's in the other 2 pots? So we looked in the other pot, and there was our lieutenant. And he thought, same thing. We just keep the fire going well and truly, get it really hot, because he was a real prick. And then we opened the 3rd lid, and there's the general from our army days. So same story. We keep the pot going. Anyway, there was a violin also in the corner. And so we learned or taught ourselves how to play the violin. And that went on for a long time, or a short time, or however long time that takes. And eventually the man who hired us came back, and he said, "Well, I see you lifted the lids off the pots, but you saved yourself by stoking the fire up. So that's okay." Said, "There's a sack over there. Collect up some of those wood chips and put them in the sack. That's your wages." And I did forget to mention that one of the instructions was that he mustn't trim his beard or trim his toenails or fingernails or wash for the duration of the time that he was down there. So they come back up to the surface, and the young man's really quite in consternation, because he realized from the look of the forest when he gets back to the top that 30 or 40 years has passed. And to him, it just felt like 2 or 3 days. So he goes along to the local inn, and of course the local innkeeper sees him coming, and he's got that smell like a wet dog crossed with dirty socks. So he doesn't want to give him a room. And then he opens the bag, and all of the wood chips that he's cut turns to gold, has turned to gold, and that's in the bag. So the young man shows the innkeeper the gold, and the innkeeper says, "Oh, yes, I do have a room. I just remember that my brother's gone to visit his sister. You can use his room." And so while the guy was sleeping, he snuck in and stole the young man's gold. What to do? So he thought, well, there was plenty more wood chips behind the door. I'll just go back and collect some more. So that's what he did. He went back and he met the little man on the way, and the little man said what happened, and he explained what happened. And he said, yeah, that's not a problem. Go and get another sack full of chips. And when you come back, we'll have a conversation. So when he came back with the wood chips, the guy who hired him, who turned out to be the devil, cuts his fingernails and cuts his hair and bathes him. And he says, when you go back to the inn, you tell the innkeeper, if he asks you who you are, you say, I am the devil's sooty brother, and he is my king also. So I think if you tell him that, the innkeeper will return your gold, because otherwise he's coming down here to stoke the pots himself. So that's how that was. And the story goes on a little way. But what's really important here is this idea of the false innkeeper who will steal your gold. And that it's not always a good idea to show everybody your gold too soon. So musicians and creative people often show their gold too soon, and other people steal it and make money out of it. So don't show your gold until the time is right, which is why the young man put the handkerchief on his head, or the bandana, or however you want to see that, because it wasn't time yet for him to show his gold. So at the end of the third day, Iron John comes in and he says, I felt something fall into the pond about 2 o'clock. He says, in itself, it's not serious, but you have to leave me now because you know a lot about gold, but you don't know anything about poverty. So in a way, Iron John is telling us that in order to fulfill our kingship, we have to learn about poverty. And one of the few ways that we can learn about poverty is being incarnate, I think, on planet Earth, because we experience a spiritual poverty here. I'm sure he wasn't talking about rands and cents or dollars. He was talking about a different sort of poverty. And why would the son of a king have to learn about poverty? Because that would be in his shadow. Because he never had to strive for anything. And in order to be a good king, in order to balance that out, he has to learn about poverty, which begins the second half of the story. And that's why when I was unpacking the second half of the story, I always have the image of the road less traveled. when we leave Iron John's enormous forest, when we leave that undifferentiated unity of the soul, we have to travel down through the birth canal into matter and the punishments of time, because now time is linear. The future is in front of us and the past is behind us, which is not the same as the time in the other world, in the story tradition, in that story space. So that's yeah. So that brings us back to the mystical marriage, of course. That mystical marriage, then Francois Everhart says he's sorry he couldn't attend. That mystical marriage represents that the unity of what we've just been discussing. So it's quite a tricky one, yeah?
A lot of info in that story.
It's a huge amount. It's a huge amount. So I don't know, maybe sometimes I overload with information. Is it too much?
No.
No.
That's rich.
It's enlightening for me.
Okay, great.
I mean, I'm thinking how powerful this remembering of this it feels like the world at the moment is very materially dense, as you say. It's kind of ego is kind of one is kind of dominating and raping and pillaging everywhere. And I've just when I think of that sacred marriage, it's all over. It's no wonder why so many marriages don't work within the kind of physical world. Is because unless I have my own house in order and I keep my own pond clear, and I'm honoring this beautiful woman who lives inside me, how have I got any chance of actually honoring any woman out there in the world?
Guys, I have to go for a wee. So you two talk to each other. I'll be back in a minute.
Cool. Frank, I just wanted to ask you, I don't know if you've been, are you there?
Yes.
It's interesting. When I was driving, I'm in East London now. There's a big thunderstorm about to start. Can you hear me?
You have a thunderstorm going on?
Yeah, there's a thunderstorm brewing in the background. It's like just as he finished the story, this thunderstorm started to brew.
Wow.
And it was interesting that the story he's speaking about now, but this thing between ego and soul. And as I was driving into East London, there was the highlights of this of the vice president's debate with old Pence and old Harris. And I was just kind of like intrigued, because you're in the US at the moment. How are you feeling about this whole thing?
Are you referring to the story?
Yeah, I'm talking about the actual sacred marriage. So at the moment, you've got someone like kind of Donald Trump. I'm not sure how much he actually honors sacred marriage in terms of soul. It feels like there's a lot of ego there.
Judge, there's no soul in Trump. I think he's totally ego and a despicable person, if you could even think of him as a person. He's done so much harm. You know, I never ever thought he would even get elected. I was flabbergasted when they said that he won the election, because I have disliked him. Well, I mean, the first time I got to know him was on his TV show, The Apprentice. And I thought he was an asshole on there too, you know, like always putting people down and always making himself look big, and it was all bluster, it was all bullshit. And the more I learn about him, the more that first impression is true. And so I'm not a big fan of his, if you can't tell, you know. I mean, I was praying that he'd get a really good dose of that COVID and have to put on one of those machines and stuff. And now I doubt that he even had it. I think they're lying through their teeth, because I don't know of anybody that recuperated in 3 days from that virus. So I think it's a big fucking bullshit act. Can't prove it, because you know his doctors are going to lie for him. Whatever he tells his doctors to say, they're going to say. And so how will we ever know if he really did have it? No way to know.
Yeah, well, I suppose it might, I don't know. It seemed to me like he was looking for the sympathy vote, you know. I deserve a fuck.
I got a problem because Sam, you're very loud and Dale is very soft. And so when you're talking, I get blown out of my ear things. And when Dale was talking, I had to turn it up. So I don't know if you could move a little bit away from your microphone, maybe that would help. Or maybe Dale can move closer. I don't. I just keep doing. You see me doing this. It's adjusting my my mic. And now you're muted. Can't hear you at all.
No, now you can hear me now. Is that better?
Yeah, now I hear you. Thank you,
And
Dale.
and me, how am I now to you?
Very loud.
Okay, so let me turn the mic down a bit. And now, check. 1, 2, 3.
Yeah,
Check.
that's good. That's good.
Okay. All right. Okay. So we went sort of from the sublime to the ridiculous. There's a joke about that. You know, what happens if the court jester makes love to the princess? It's the ridiculous on the sublime. Yeah.
Hey, I wanted to ask you if you've ever heard of a book called The Rag and the Bone Shop of the Heart.
Yeah, I've got it.
Oh, okay. I had it and it's disappeared. I don't know what happened to it, but
so that passage
reason,
yeah.
For some reason, last week that popped into my head because I had so many of those poems marked off because I liked reading them.
Yeah. So a lot of the poems that I speak come out of there. And that thing from James Hillman was in there.
Yeah, he's the one that wrote that book. Yeah,
he wrote that piece. Yeah. Oh.
So the book is called the Rag and Bone Shaft of the Heart.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and who's the narrator? Or?
James Hillman.
So James Hillman, Michael Mead, and Robert Bly edited together, the three of them. Yeah, well worth having if you like poetry. Yeah. So what do you think? We've been going for an hour and a half. Shall we finish up with a poem? Does anybody want to say anything? Ask a question, make a comment? Sometimes it's really hard, because this stuff takes us deep and we need to percolate it through.
Exactly. I do have a question at the end of this that I wanted to ask you, and maybe it's after you turn off the recording because it has nothing to do with the story or anything.
Okay. Well, in that case, let me turn it off. Where's my mouse? There it is.